So I was watching Hajime no Ippo today, and there was an episode that really caught my eye. It was the best episode of the show by far so far, and unfortunately, I looked into it, and it was the product of an episode director who will not make another appearance throughout the rest of the show. It was the guy who did Ultimate Survivor Kaiji, so now I'm a lot more interested in looking into that series and some of his other directorial works. But it gave me the distinct sensation that I got when I was watching some of my favorite fights from Ashita Joe, and it sort of stirred up this dialogue or monologue within my head once again, where I don't know what to make of Ashita Joe. Ashita Joe is the greatest enigma in anime to me. There is no show I've ever watched that I have more conflicting feelings about, yet I can still unequivocally say I love it. When I say that, I mean that when Ashita Joe is at its best, directorially, from a writing standpoint, from a production standpoint, it might be my favorite anime of all time. And there is a very substantial sample size that I'm referring to here. Like, I'm talking about the entirety. The way I would describe it is like when Joe is in juvie, that whole arc is a great time. When Joe is preparing to fight and fights Wolf, that's a really good time as well. When Joe fights Rikishi, that's the first moment in the show, that whole arc, which constitutes like the final quarter of the first season, is the first time that the show genuinely transcends almost any other like action show, any other anime, any other thing I've watched, and becomes an all-time classic to me. And then the second season starts, and there's a lot more consistency as far as the production is concerned, but it starts off really weak in my opinion, and I don't really care for it too much until the Carlos stuff gets started. The arcs do get a lot shorter in the second season as well. But then the Carlos arc happens, and once again, the show is super good. And then the Kim arc happens, and it's a controversial take to say this, but then I think the show gets right back to being god tier. One of my favorites ever. And then you have a stretch of some of the worst episodes in the entire show. And then the finale against Jose is literally my favorite arc in anime history. So the discrepancy in quality from arc to arc in Ashita Joe, to me personally, is absolutely vast, and I don't even know what to totally attribute this to. Some of it is circumstantial. Like, from a storytelling perspective, the first 8 or 9 episodes of the second season of Ashita Joe totally makes sense, because Joe has to learn an extremely emotionally excruciating lesson that he's never learned anything like before, and his personality is that he is extremely stubborn and will not admit that there's something that he's still caught up on or going through. He will not know how to approach it. He doesn't really have the tools to assess and deal with these things. But at the same time, when Joe is having to learn the same lesson over and over and over again, the series could really deal with having more interesting B plots, and I think that comes from the fact that it really just does not have a super well-rounded cast of characters. Like, a lot of the antagonists that are introduced in season 2 and season 1, frankly, are just some of the most interesting, fascinating characters with the most aura, as the kids say, of like any I've seen. And Joe is one of my favorite protagonists ever. But once you sort of look past that aspect of the character cast, it starts to get a bit weaker. Like Nishi, for example. I respect Nishi as a literary device and as a foil to Joe in a way that emphasizes... there's some Nishi episodes I absolutely love, and it's a way that emphasizes the riskiness and the trials of the path that Joe takes, because Nishi ultimately quits boxing. But as a character, by his own merits... he's pretty sycophantic to Joe. He's just like a normal everyman. And, as season 2 happens, he's one of the characters who does get a little bit of emotional depth, but I can't say there was ever very much charisma, in my opinion, from when I saw him on screen. Danpei is, very interesting because he has the backstory of being the failed boxer, strung out, can't live for himself, needs somebody to vicariously live through, and then eventually finds Joe, sees the potential in him, pushes him to his limit, at some points pushes him away, slowly grows attached to him as something of a son, and gradually becomes a worse trainer as he becomes a better father figure in the extremely conflicted Joe's life. But Danpei's interesting. Yoko sucks. I mean, Yoko, once again, I understand what they were trying to do with Yoko's character arc and learning to humanize and understand from the outside looking in the sacrifice and real human destruction of the sport of boxing. But, she's kind of just evil. Like, kind of everything's her fault for, like, guilt-tripping Joe into getting back into it because she was arrogant and speaking from a place of, like, never really having experienced the pain of boxing or hurting someone or killing someone or, all of these extremely grave and major consequences firsthand. She kind of like leads to the end of Joe, and I don't really know why Joe would ever end up falling for her other than the fact that he's, a knucklehead and it just kind of like feels right. Like, I never really appreciated Yoko as a character. Like, she was working towards redeeming herself at a certain point, but there was way too long where I felt like the show was giving her a little bit too much credit. And, when you start to get past them, there's a lot of side characters that I didn't really, remember all that well or care for all that well and weren't really introduced as having many wrinkles to their personality in general. I remember there was one character in season 1. He was a doctor. He was sort of like a seedy doctor who would inspect fighters in like weirdly intrusive and violent and potentially dangerous ways. And at one point, he was like weeding out people who wanted to join the gym by being like, if you can't get inspected by me, you can't fight. Because he would just have these like horrible inspections. The narrative genuinely, wholeheartedly appears to have simply forgotten about him and he just disappears from the story at some point. And, that's not the end of the issues, the egregious issues of season 1. Unfortunately, just due to the circumstances of the production, the time when it was produced, there are a lot of flagrant animation errors, something that would never, ever in a million years make it to the final draft of an anime today. Even when we're getting shit like Zom 100, where the production falls apart horrendously by the second half of the first season, it's not as egregious as some of the stuff that's in Ashita no Joe Season 1. But also in Ashita no Joe Season 1 is some absolutely incredible experimental psychedelic direction, which makes for some of the greatest moments in the anime to me. Like, there's so many moments during the Rikishi fight, you have these bone-crushing, weird, like, whale and motor noises when these guys are getting hit and they become disoriented, and there's, all of this psychedelic and repeating imagery. Everything starts to, like go double and go static and phase in and out, and the backgrounds get very vibrant and like almost tie-dye. Like, there's a lot of really weird experimental audio-visual stuff that happens during these fights, especially with the color palette and sound design, that you don't really see so much in Season 2. Season 2 has an absolutely gorgeous and captivating aesthetic, but at the same time really tones down the surrealist imagery and the direction, which was one of my favorite parts about Season 1. So, there's like a push and pull the whole way. And furthermore, the music takes a huge hit in Season 2. The music in Season 1 was incredible, but I don't know what like the problems were with like the copyright or whatever, but they couldn't carry it over. The OPs and EDs in Season 2 kind of blow, but that's not the biggest criticism ever. A lot of the actual music in the show, I'm mixed on it. I'm not just going to uncomplicatedly like claim that it's distinctly worse in every way. It does have its moments where I feel like it enhances the scenes in a unique way, but it definitely becomes a much more generic 80s soundtrack. While the first season had an extreme like rustic sense of identity to it, into the way it sounds and into even the sound design, though that had its drawbacks due to the production making everything sound like it was being filmed inside of a cave. But yeah, with Season 2, they also changed all the voice actors. And some decisions I really didn't like. Nishi lost a lot of his personality when he lost his big dumb mammoth voice, and maybe even a bit of his charisma. Joe was fine. Danpei was kind of lost a lot of his personality too. It kind of just got a lot more streamlined and by the books, which doesn't mean that it didn't still have absolutely unbelievable moments of storytelling, character writing, direction, and just god tier shit, basically. I mean, there's god tier shit happening all over the final third of that season of Ashita no Joe. But then also right before it, in that like middle stretch, Kim arc notwithstanding, you're getting these filler arcs with like the Malaysian guy who's like a little bit racy, if you ask me. Like, they were cutting it pretty close to some like racial characterizing there, but not to like lib out. You can just look at the Smiley arc for a less divisive example, where you can just say like, yeah, that guy didn't have to. I mean, spoiler alert, that guy didn't have to die. It's almost a mockery of the tone and grit of the rest of the show when Joe fights somebody and the conclusion isn't quite as dramatically impactful as some of the other fights. So they just have him sort of go around and die in a fairly contrived car crash that really didn't need to happen, in an arc that really didn't need to happen in general either. I understand the purpose of the arc from with the Malaysian tiger or whatever, but at the end of the day, it still doesn't mean I particularly liked it. I thought the fight choreography was getting a little goofy for my liking, because I really liked the more grounded edge that, you know, even season 2 specifically did admittedly bring to the table. There's just so many pros and cons to each season, and then there's also the persisting issue of the show just sort of having inconsistent quality from arc to arc for me. You know, at the very beginning, I was having trouble getting used to how rough around the edges the production was. And the character of Joe still kind of had to grow on me because he comes off as extremely grating at first, and the characters haven't really showed off their the wrinkles to their personality yet. And then, you know, we have some good stuff happen. And then, you know, we're going into the part of the story once again where Joe has to learn this lesson over and over and over again, and I don't think the B-plots are really able to keep it being interesting. And then we go to parts in the story where the fights get a little bit redundant, and there's not as much of a narrative sense of identity to each one. There's not as much of a narrative purpose or a character writing purpose to the encounters, and a lot of times I feel the directorial flourishes of the great Osamu Dezaki sort of wearing a little bit thin. Like it's in Hawaii, for example, when Joe fights that guy, the tall guy. That fight's not really that interesting. They still make it, you know, quite dramatic. It's season 2, so the imagery of the fight isn't necessarily experimental and memorable enough to, you know, stand on its own by just those merits alone. But it's a fine fight. There's not really a ton of thematic purpose to it. You know, it's kind of all the context around that fight, with Jose making racial remarks about Joe, and sort of goading Joe into challenging him for the title eventually by the end of that arc. It's all sort of just in service of training to defeat Jose, and I feel like that's what a lot of season 2 is about. And it definitely, admittedly, does do a good job of setting up that last arc, of being that much more, having that much more gravitas, having that much more tension. Because that last arc really is a fucking masterpiece. The last arc of both seasons of Ashita no Joe are like, I cannot do justice to how incredible they are. Breathtaking. But yeah, it's like during that fight, how many times are we going to see the triple pan, the zoom, 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 and then the, what do they call it? The like freaking sometimes like 3 postcard memories an episode. And, you know, we have all the horrible English. Like, I'm sorry, but in both seasons, the English is so bad. Every single non-Japanese fighter speaks English, and it'll be during some of the most intense moments, even in the best arcs. It'll be like, you won't know who's going to live or die, and you're going to be on the edge of your seat, and, you know, like, everything in your mind is just, like, flipped upside down because the chaos is unfolding in such a beautiful and disturbing way that you don't even know what to think. And then you just hear the corner from Jose going, "Hey, Jose, are you okay?" Or like, "Hey, Jose, now's your chance." Like right in the middle of the most intense moment in like the entire show that's had like hours and hours and hours worth of episodes of build up to this exact moment. And you don't know what's going to happen. Then you just get the, "Jose, now's your chance." Or something. I don't even know what accent it is. I don't even think it's a Japanese accent. It sounds Irish when I'm repeating it. Which admittedly does undercut some of the tension, you know? Like, this production is, in my opinion, a bit flawed, and the character cast is not the most well fleshed out. Not all these characters are super multi-dimensional, and that's sort of just part of the problem I've always had with Ashita no Joe, which unfortunately maybe brings it down from being on, like, my all-time favorites list, because, I mean, those fights... The fights are absolutely unforgettable. The character arc of Joe is legendary, and I will never forget it till the day I die, and it's something that I've always wanted to see, and I feel like it specifically appeals to me so much. And there's so much I've said about it. If you want to watch my other rant about Ashita no Joe, I'm a lot more obviously complimentary of it, because my mission statement with this video is sort of to air out all of the less developed thoughts that I've been thinking about it, and all of the conflicting things that really make me wonder if it deserves a spot on my favorite list or not. As it stands, it doesn't. And, it's not really good to get too caught up on this, but even the fact that I remember all of these more specific criticisms, and admittedly I do have a lot more nitpicks that I'm not going to really get into in this video, because I think after a certain point it gets redundant. The sheer, volume of details, positive or negative, I remember about the show is pretty much unprecedented for me personally, because I don't tend to have a really great memory when it comes to media, when it comes to the specific details. I definitely remember the emotions that I felt when watching something and my overall impression of it consistently, but I'd be hard-pressed to think of any other piece of media that I remembered this amount of just details about. So maybe that's ultimately the biggest sign I need to just put it on my favorites list already. It seriously has some of the best moments in anime to me, maybe the best moments in anime to me. Up there with things like March Comes in Like a Lion, which is on my absolute favorites list, like the end of Evangelion, which is on my absolute favorites list. There's really nothing that it can't go blow for blow with, but at the same time, when it's at its worst, I would never say it's an outright bad show, because the charisma of the main character, Joe Ibuki, and the personal appeal it has to me, and the overall strengths of the productions of each season, and its influence, and the fight direction and choreography is definitely always enough to keep it to where it's above mid. But at its worst, I can't really call it much more than that. But that was always just my personal opinion. I know this is a show that a lot of people hold extremely dearly. They see it as sacred and almost above criticism even. But this is my personal thoughts about Ashita no Joe, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Because there's a lot that I still probably have left unsaid. This is one of those shows that you never really stop thinking about. But I don't know what to make of it. It truly is such an enigma to me. I guess, and one of the other things is I love the concept of the show. I love the concept of the fighter who is learning how to be a better person, and you also see this reflected in Denpei and Yoko's arcs of them learning how to accept Joe as a fully fledged human with all of these dynamic sides to him, while his mind and body deteriorate around him from the damage he's taken in the fights that society has essentially pressured him into having to engage in. But at the same time, the understanding of what CT was a bit more primitive. CTE. The understanding of what CTE was a bit more primitive at the time that Ashita no Joe was airing. And so not all of it is the most fluid, and I guess it's not the most realistic depiction of what that deterioration would actually look like. I obviously don't hold this against the show too much, but that was, I guess, the main last non-redundant thing I was going to mention that I don't really see as a nitpick, but a little bit more as a fundamental flaw with the show. But also, I don't want this video, because I've been so consistently negative due to that being the mission statement, to give anybody the impression that I don't absolutely fucking love this show. This is one of my favorite shows of all time. And even if it's not on my out and out favorite list, it's easily in my top 20 or so. So yeah, I've just been really toiling back and forth on this one. I don't know what to make of this show. I just don't know.